100% certain, so I'm going to go check. But howdy, YouTube, I'm cordless. This is a pretty janky setup, actually. I don't know that you're going to be able to see my screen, my whiteboard very well. Let me try to find something that I can fix that with. I'll be right back. This whole live streaming thing is, I don't know, it's a lot of work. And yeah, okay, I'm live for sure. Okay, so now I got to figure out how to get you closer to the board, because I had my camera set up, my phone, and I was streaming off of it, but then it just stopped working, and I couldn't get it to work again. So I was like, screw it, I'm going to do it with my computer. I'll be right back. Alright, I'm having to have some ingenuity here. I've got paper towel rolls that I'll set you on. There you go, YouTube. That's kind of tipped up a little bit, but I was just going to have to deal with it. So, I think, we check the quality on that. On the tube, you're not going to be able to see any of that crap. It looks like, that looks pretty good. Yeah, okay. Well, I guess that'll work. I'll scoot it forward just a little bit. And maybe clean the lens a little bit. Okay, so you're not going to be able to see my head. I'll tip it up just a little bit. This is less than ideal, but it'll work. It doesn't matter. So my name's Cord Campbell, Cordless, if you know me. You can call me Cordless. That's my handle on the internet. That's how you can find me on the internet, in fact. Now there appears to be a rapper named Cordless. I've listened to some of his stuff. It's pretty good, so whatever, go for it, dude. So anyway, it's kind of nice. I'm not the only one that is on the internet named Cordless anymore. So today I'm going to be talking about, I'm looking for a whiteboard pen. Today I'm going to be talking about the Lightning Network. And I'm also going to be talking about applying the Lightning Network to something that's less than obvious that I've been thinking about for a really long time, which is cryptocurrencies being applied to API calls. So, and then I'll talk a little bit about the use cases. But first, what I'm going to do is we're going to cover three things today. We're going to cover the use of cryptocurrencies. So we're going to cover a little bit of crypto. And I say the use a bit, like the technology behind it. We're going to cover the Lightning Network. And we're going to cover some API technology. And then I'm going to provide some clarity on what I'm talking about here with applying this to cryptocurrencies. So first off, cryptocurrencies are a thing now. They've been a thing since probably 2013. Most people that are in the tech scene became aware of cryptocurrencies in the form of Bitcoin. So there are a bunch of cryptocurrencies. If you talk about cryptocurrency, you usually talk about Bitcoin. You'll hear terms like blockchain and things like that applied to cryptocurrency technologies. But there are probably 10 or so, maybe 10 cryptocurrencies that are worth looking at. Some of those include Bitcoin, Ethereum, Ripple, Stellar, Litecoin, Dogecoin, things like that. All of these technologies, cryptocurrencies in general, that leverage a blockchain, all have something in common, which is that they can store values in essentially a distributed database in a trustworthy way. And there's a variety of ways that trust is achieved with these data storage databases, if you will. Sometimes they're called ledgers, like a ledger in a book where you would write down values. The way that I like to think about cryptocurrencies in order to visualize it better, and I don't visualize, but in order to tell people how to think about them a little bit better, is I like to say that cryptocurrencies are computed trust. So they allow you to take a computer, a whole bunch of computers strung together, and allow you to calculate trust that humans embody in their brains, which is sort of irrational, and then come to some consensus with a bunch of computers and humans signing things with keys, encryption keys, to arrive at some truth that then cannot be altered by an irrational actor. So in other words, like a hacker hacking the system. And so today, cryptocurrencies have more or less achieved that goal within reason. And we're going to talk about two cryptocurrencies today only, which are Bitcoin and Litecoin. And then we're going to talk about the technology behind the Lightning Network. So with Litecoin or Bitcoin, right now, there aren't a lot of technologies built on top of those technologies. In other words, the technology itself allows people to exchange value. And for example, if you were to go buy Bitcoin or Litecoin with cash or fiat currency or a credit card or something like that, you would have to go to a service such as Coinbase, for example, give them a credit card or give them your bank account number where they can do a wire transfer. And then in exchange for that money that you give them, they'll give you Bitcoin or Litecoin. And so they have a piece of software that does all this, that sits off to the side of Bitcoin, that it allows them to exchange value, and then they take the cash and they could go, pay for servers or something like that with it. But in general, the two systems are kept separate except for when you deal with what you call an exchange, where you buy Bitcoin or Litecoin. And up until now, that's been pretty much it. If you go into a store and you have a wallet on your phone that you're carrying around and you want to pay for something with Bitcoin, you have to go somewhere that takes Bitcoin. And in order for them to take that Bitcoin from you, you would point your phone at a QR code that would contain a Bitcoin address. And then essentially your phone signs a transaction and submits it to the Bitcoin network through its internet connection. And then that vendor or whoever, if they're selling you a cup of tea, then they would take note that the transaction hit the network. And if they wanted to, they could wait until miners validated the network, the transaction on the network, and then give you your cup of tea. Well, the problem with that is, currently in Bitcoin land, is that the number of transactions on the Bitcoin network are sort of limited. And the reason they're limited varies greatly. It's based on the software that the miners are running and the size of the transactions, the number of transactions that are being conducted and things like that. But in general, you can just sort of imagine that there's about 10 transactions per second available on the Bitcoin network. Sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less. It depends on what's going on. But in general, it's about that. And if you think about it, that's not a lot, especially when you consider the Visa network handles many orders of magnitude more transactions than that. And so this big argument has kind of cropped up in general with Bitcoin is, well, what's the use of Bitcoin if you can't put a lot of transactions on the network? And it's a fair assessment. And in fact, somebody thought about this very early on with the code and added a feature which was called microtransactions to allow the Bitcoin network to be able to handle smaller transactions, such as what you might do if you were buying a cup of tea, for example, from somebody, and or even less. And but the thing is that the cost of these transactions, or validating a transaction on the Bitcoin network, has gone up substantially because people are now buying lots of Bitcoin and Litecoin and other cryptocurrencies for fiat currency, which is just cash, US dollars or the euro or whatever. And that's pretty much where Bitcoin is right now. I mean, that's, and the long and short of it is people buy it and they're speculating on it and assuming that people are going to use it. That's most of the transactions on the Bitcoin network are for that. They're not for coffee. Although, I mean, there are people, lots of companies take Bitcoin for things, but there's not a lot of transactions going on in that regard, like Visa or writing checks or using cash or anything like that. It's not of that quantity yet. Most of it is speculative in nature because the technology is good for being able to embody trust within a human population. So the humans typically can trust Bitcoin to do transactions. It's just that the technology hasn't been spread, and the use cases haven't spread yet out into the world such that lots and lots of people use Bitcoin for buying things. Right now, lots and lots of people are buying Bitcoin with fiat currency. So kind of the way that I imagine this is that you have you have a situation where Bitcoin is becoming more valuable because traditional economic value, such as stored in fiat, is becoming less valuable to people. That's sort of how I look at it. I don't look at Bitcoin, accelerating because it's great technology or anything like that. It is great technology, but really things take off when adoption takes off, and adoption can only take off when everybody starts being able to use it, and that just hasn't been the case up until now. So we're kind of at this juncture in the life of Bitcoin that we're able to do more things with it. And the reason why that's occurring is because of a couple of different things. So number one, as I've mentioned, Bitcoin is kind of limited in its ability to do things quickly. And so there are some proposals about fixing that, which I'm not going to go into here very much. But I will mention that one of those proposals is a thing called SegWit, or segregated witness. And SegWit, and I'm going to talk about Litecoin here pretty much exclusively in just a minute, but Bitcoin and Litecoin are very similar crypto technologies. In fact, Litecoin is more or less what you would call a clone of Bitcoin. Segregated witness is a means by which you are able to, let me figure out the best way to put this. I suppose that I should not go delve completely into segregated witness. It's most important to think about when segregated witness, a feature for both Litecoin and Bitcoin, does go live, and that is getting ready to happen for sure for Litecoin. One of the net effects of segregated witness for both cryptocurrencies, once Bitcoin goes live, it will be true of it as well, is that the header, and a header is just simply a block of data that's contained inside of a packet or a dated construct. If you were to look at internet traffic, for example, as your browser sends a server data, there's a header in there that says, what your IP address is, what the website is that you're asking for, what the size is of the request, things like that. That's sort of what a header is. It's kind of like, if you want to sort of imagine like something you stuff in an envelope that says this is the birthday invitation, and this is this is the reply, the RSVP note that you send back, right? So headers are just indicating like what the component, the data that you're talking about, what it is. And so a header inside of Bitcoin transactions has a whole bunch of headers inside of a Bitcoin transaction or inside of a Litecoin transaction. And one of those things that's inside of a header right now in cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Litecoin are transaction IDs. And these IDs are made out of a hash or a random string that's created using a bunch of values that are created whenever someone signs a Bitcoin transaction or a Litecoin transaction and sends it to someone else. And those transaction IDs currently in Bitcoin and in Litecoin are what are called malleable, which means that they can be changed by someone after you put them up on the network, which is not a great thing, but it doesn't really affect current Bitcoin transactions because most Bitcoin transactions today are done immediately. What most people don't realize is that you can actually take a Bitcoin wallet and you can send a value to a Bitcoin address. I could give you a Bitcoin address right now that you could use with your wallet, and you could, if your piece of software that you were using supported it, sign that transaction, that authorization by you to send me some value in Bitcoin that you control, or Litecoin. And the thing is, though, is that the feature is already there to support being able to post date that. So it's like a post dated check. So in other words, if you don't want to give somebody some money today, but you would like to give them the indication that you're going to give them money, like you want to give them the check so that they can take it with them and feel comfortable that you're actually going to do that. It's a promise that you're going to pay them. Then you can post date it, and you can do that with Bitcoin transactions. You can post date them. So if today I were to post date a transaction and send you some value on the Bitcoin blockchain, I could post date it. But the problem with that is that the ID of that transaction could later be manipulated or changed by someone because there's this malleability problem. So it would technically allow a bad actor to change something in their favor at a future date. And well, that's not ideal, especially if you're trying to get things to be trustworthy between individuals. So segregated witness, among other things, what it does is it fixes that problem and moves the header out of the main block of the transaction to its own header, and then it fixes the code that allows it to be malleable. And what that means is that it now has a fixed ID, so if you post a transaction with a transaction ID, you can't modify it anymore on the blockchain, even if it has not been processed by the network, which means mined. So when a transaction goes out to the miners validate the transaction and then close the block. We'll close a block that includes those transactions. If the transaction is not slated to be closed yet, well then that'll get done at a later date and stays open. So that's kind of how it works. So just think about checks, post-dated checks, sort of this problem. All right, so now that I've covered crypto more or less, I've blabbed on a bit, and I've covered sort of how cryptocurrencies sort of work and about SegWit and the coming of SegWit. I'm going to talk about the Lightning Network. And hopefully I'll do a little bit better job of going into a little bit more detail on how the Lightning Network works. But I am not a cryptographer. I'm a generalist. I am a general technologist, futurist, if you will. So I can talk about technologies, but go too far down into them, my knowledge sort of peters out, and I have to have a big picture view of things. That's kind of my function. So the Lightning Network leverages SegWit, but does not require SegWit. But the problem is the Lightning Network does leverage post-dating things. So if you're going to use the Lightning Network to be trustworthy, you need to launch it on a blockchain that has something like segregated witness on it. So technically, Lightning doesn't need SegWit, but it needs that transaction malleability fix in order for it to be trustworthy. So that's sort of the chain of logic here, is that you want SegWit on Bitcoin so that you can have Lightning on Bitcoin. So right now with Bitcoin, there's a big argument about how to fix the transaction malleability problem, how to fix the block size problem. There's a sort of a problem coming that there's the size of the blocks are getting too big for the miners to mine, and some of them don't want to mine bigger blocks and some do, and it's a big mess. And well, what happened is that Charlie Lee, the guy that did Litecoin originally, and there are other people involved in Litecoin who I'm leaving out here, and apologies to you if you're one of those, is that what Charlie decided to do, more or less, was he said, well, Litecoin can do it. Well, we can get Litecoin SegWit approved, which the approval process with Litecoin is slightly different than Bitcoin. And he said, if we get that approved, SegWit, approved for Litecoin, then we can launch the Lightning Network on it. So they set about to do that, put out the proposal. It was approved, and in about 2 weeks, or a little less than 2 weeks, we're actually going to have the Lightning Network, or SegWit, go live on Litecoin, which means that the Lightning Network can go live on Litecoin. And I note here that I'm running out of, a little bit running low on time, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about Lightning real quick, and then I'm going to pause the stream, and then I'm going to go do some stuff, and then I'm going to come back and resume it. And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to explain how Lightning works real fast, and then pause the stream. All right, so Lightning is an off-chain solution, and essentially what it does is it embodies the transaction signing process. So what happens is somebody with an IP address, Alice, has an IP address, and she wishes to speak to Bob, who also has an IP address. Alice contacts Bob. Now, you'll have to think about, how does Alice find Bob? Well, there's a variety of ways. You could start a service that advertises Bob's IP address and his Bitcoin addresses. But nevertheless, it's sort of like a web browser hitting a web server. So IP contacts an IP, Alice's IP contacts Bob's IP, and they then begin to sign transactions with each other. And the transactions they're signing are ready to go onto the Bitcoin, or in this case we're going to talk exclusively about Litecoin, onto the Litecoin network. So what would happen would be that Alice would say, hey Bob, I'm going to send you some Bitcoin. So maybe she says, I'm going to send you 1 Bitcoin. Bob says, okay, I'm okay with that. But then what Alice does is she actually dates that transaction. So she says, she's going to put a +9 on this. Now, she doesn't have to do that. There are other ways for her to do this, but I'm just trying to make this as simple as possible. I'm going to put a link, after I'm done doing the second part of this live stream, I'll put a link in both of the videos, because it's going to make 2 videos when I stop the stream, on a guy that will explain this to you better than I'm explaining to you, because he fundamentally understands how it works. Not that I don't sort of understand how it works. But essentially she says, well, I'm going to give you 1 Bitcoin in 9 days. But then Bob says, that's great. That sounds fantastic. What would you like to do? And meanwhile, they do some other stuff on the side. Maybe Bob gives her some tea, or maybe Bob gives her a lot of tea because it's 1 Bitcoin, right? Or maybe Bob gives her some computer parts, or maybe Bob lets her call his API on his hosted web service. Whatever it is, they're doing that off-chain. They're not doing it here, but they're negotiating this value that they owe each other by having a connection with each other. And these are called, this particular thing is called a payment channel. And what it allows Alice to do without talking to the Bitcoin blockchain is promise, by signing a transaction to Bob and giving it to Bob in a public way on their payment channel, it just indicates to Bob that Alice is serious about giving him this 1 Bitcoin. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen. It just means that Alice is engaged with Bob, like a business transaction, in this activity. Now, I would add here that, in theory, if you were able to provide a service that gave people the IP addresses of each other and their payment addresses, and tied to some public identity, like your face to this, like if through an avatar, the trust would increase by human means, irrational means, through this service. So as time goes on, and maybe Bob is giving Alice, cups of tea while over these 9 days or whatever, at some point, what Bob can say is, hey, I want to close this block. I want to close this transaction. I want to close it by putting it into a block. And so Alice can agree to do that. So at some point, they have some tally they've been keeping. And again, if you watch the Lightning Network video, it'll give you a little bit better update, a little bit better description on this. But essentially what Alice can do is agree with Bob that at some point that for sure she owes him that amount of money, and they create a new transaction, and they make it where it's smaller than the previous transaction. Maybe let's just say it's 1. But then actually what happens is Bob ends up paying, to do this, Bob ends up paying Alice back 0.8 Bitcoin. So now the net is that Bob's going to get 0.2 Bitcoin because Alice signed a transaction that said she basically promised Bob that in 9 days she was going to pay him 1 Bitcoin. And then a little bit of time goes on and other things happen. Bob and Alice are talking to each other, and then all of a sudden Alice says, yeah, I'm okay with that. And then Bob signs a transaction which Alice approves, and saying that that Bob's going to give her back 0.8 of that Bitcoin. And then when that day expires, the Bitcoin network, and then it's posted to the Bitcoin network, and when that day expires, it is then processed. And the net effect is, on the Bitcoin network, a transaction is made, a single transaction, no matter how many times they yak back and forth to each other about whatever it was they were doing, that Alice ends up paying Bob 0.2 Bitcoin on the Bitcoin network. So that's more or less how Lightning works from a single payment. It's like you're going back and forth, but it only involves 2 people. Again, I'm going to post up the video about it, and now I have to go run and do something because it's my daughter's birthday, and I have a pizza to deliver to her, and I will be back here just momentarily. I'll be back in about 30 minutes, so stay tuned. I'll see you then. This is Cordless out. Give me a thumbs up or subscribe if you like what you see.